Good day, everyone, and welcome to the Walker's breakout session entitled Don't Dabble, where we provide practical advice in relation to setting up your digital assets. I'm delighted to be joined by my fellow panelists, and I'll introduce them all to you. Firstly, we have Kevin Richards, who is the Managing Director for BAM Advisors, a Bermuda-based fintech advisory firm. That's part of the Bermuda Asset Management Group, where he provides non-executive directorship services, senior representative services for licensed entities, angel and early stage investment introductions, and advisory work on commercial and operational matters in Bermuda. We are also joined by Stafford Lowe, who is the Chief Operating Partner of Your Partners, a Bermuda-based specialist management consulting firm providing fractional C-suite services and other business solutions to early stage fintech companies between seed and Series B. And Brett Henshilwood, who is a risk advisory partner based at Deloitte in Bermuda, where he leads the cyber risk team and operational risk for the Caribbean Bermuda cluster. Brett has over 25 years of experience in risk management, internal controls, audit, information technology, systems management, and information security management. He also has extensive experience in the management, design, development, and implementation of cybersecurity and risk management programs, and actively participates in the development of cybersecurity awareness programs throughout Bermuda and the Caribbean, serving on the Bermuda government's cyber board. Recently, he's been assisting companies with licensing requirements under Bermuda's digital assets regime, one of the first globally. And finally, Melanie Fullerton, who is our Senior Risk and Regulatory Counsel and leads our practice in Bermuda. Melanie regularly advises clients on Bermuda's regulatory framework, as well as the evolving regulatory landscape. In particular, she advises financial services businesses on a wide range of regulatory matters, including economic substance, data protection, AML, ATF, and regulatory governance. She joined Walker's in 2019 from the Bermuda Monetary Authority, where she worked in their legal enforcement and policy department, and was an integral member of the CFATF Mutual Evaluation Assessment Team, where she was responsible for completing the technical assessment. And as for myself, my name is Natalie Neto. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a partner at Walker's Bermuda, and I head up our fintech team and have the pleasure of working with a number of digital assets businesses seeking to navigate the landscape. And I think the purpose of this panel is really to try and guide any potential digital assets businesses to the various requirements for establishing your business in Bermuda, both to meet the statutory requirements and other regulatory touch points, but also to help you get your feet under the table here. So I'll kick off without further ado. And I think the biggest subject or most common subject we get asked about as practitioners is how to meet the head office test under Dabble. You may or may not be aware, but Dabble, the Digital Assets Business Act, requires licensees which have a Class M or a Class F license to have a head office in Bermuda. So it's not required for a Class T or test license for the beta testing. And the Class M license and Class F are different because the Class M is a modified license. So you are able to scale up the head office during the period of your Class M license to your Class F. And the BMA has recently published some guidance on head office and makes that point emphatically, that the BMA expects you to have presence in Bermuda that is commensurate to the nature, scale, and complexity of the business. There are a number of sort of senior officers and management that you would expect to have in place, including a Chief Information Security Officer, a Chief Compliance Officer, and MLRO, which could be the same person. And oftentimes that will be the way in which digital assets businesses will look to have persons in place, those sort of two key positions serving the Bermuda operations. However, that's not the only way to meet the requirements, and I'd like to sort of ask Stafford in particular to mention how he's helping digital assets business scale up through that requirement to have a head office.
Thanks, Natalie, and thank you very much for inviting me along to this panel. So I think before I answer that question, I just want to give the BMA a quick plug to kind of help set the context for the discussion, because we're about to dive into some fairly heavy topics. And so I think it's probably worth saying at the outset that, in my opinion at least, the BMA aren't actually asking for anything that wouldn't be expected of either an enterprise grade tech company or a licensed institutional grade, financial services firm. I think they've learned a tremendous amount over the last 3 years of working closely with companies who've wanted to get licensed. And Bermuda's record really does speak for itself when you look at the likes of Circle, Crosstower, Bittrex, XBTO, and a number of other serious players who've all come in and gone through the process of getting their Dabble licenses. The reality, though, is that these serious players for such a young space are still young companies, and so there's a great sort of level playing field opportunity for startups who want to accelerate their business credentials by getting licensed in Bermuda. So look, to come back to your original question, I think one area where the BMA have demonstrated a very appropriate level of flexibility is in their open-minded approach to how companies manage the people side of their business operations. They know that out there is a war for talent, and that any company seeking to grow needs to be adaptable in how they staff themselves. This is everywhere in the world and not just in Bermuda. So the fact that the BMA are very open to the fact that companies are able to engage with third parties to provide services where they can provide advice and support and presence on the ground, I think is the right approach ultimately as companies sort of build themselves. But at Your Partners, we've developed a sort of a very comprehensive approach to interim management services. We want to embed with clients, and it's not just about helping them get through a licensing process. It's about helping them build their business. So I think that the BMA just want to see that the approach to building a business and building all of the correct processes are solid and watertight. But other than that, they're very flexible about allowing companies to construct their teams in whichever way works best for them, be it with interim resources or perm employees, either based in Bermuda or elsewhere.
Yeah, we've certainly seen that, and sort of recognition that this is a sort of, it's a digital sector, and, to a certain extent, in many cases, the humans, the presence of humans doesn't really matter where they are. So you did touch upon the flexibility of the BMA, and Mel, just to mention, we've seen many of our digital assets business look to outsource some of those roles that I mentioned earlier, and that's possible, isn't it?
Absolutely. So under the Dabble legislation and the relevant codes of conduct, there is the ability to outsource, sort of the AML ATF compliance function, a general compliance function. We see a lot of people outsourcing the cybersecurity piece, the audit, and then potentially the asset management. You can outsource externally to a third-party service provider that's not connected to your business, or even to an affiliate. So if you have, if your company is operating in multiple locations, there is the potential to outsource some of your services to that affiliate. What's really key to remember when it comes to outsourcing is it kind of starts from the top. The board needs to be engaged on those outsourced service, who those outsourced service providers are going to be, what activities are being outsourced. There needs to be a risk assessment conducted on whether it is appropriate for the risk appetite of your business to outsource those services and what risk that presents. Your board needs to be looking at those service level agreements with scrutiny and ensuring that the responsibilities are clearly defined, and that service agreement ensures that the level of service that your Bermuda entity is going to be receiving is in line with Bermuda laws, for example. It needs to be compliant with the jurisdiction. you also need to ensure that any third-party service provider that you engage is actually fit and proper to do the job. So not necessarily looking for the cheapest or the one who has the most capacity to get on board the quickest, but who actually has the expert experience and can provide you with the technical knowledge that you require to be able to outsource that service.
Yeah.
And then lastly, we always have to remind people that you can outsource the service and you can outsource to a third-party service provider, but you can't outsource the risk. So the company always maintains the requirement to meet the BMA requirements. And that's really important to remember, because if something does go awry, the BMA aren't going to go and look for the third-party service provider that you engaged. They're going to be coming and knocking on your door. So those are some of the key things to remember when you're considering engaging with third-party service providers.
Thank you. I think those are important points. And Brett, maybe if you could just touch upon what Melanie mentioned there, which is it's how important it is to make sure that you've got the correct governance structure in to be able to manage outsourcing and other kind of risks.
Thanks, Natalie. And I think I'll build on what Stafford and both Melanie said. So the requirements around governance are no different to any other sector that the BMA regulate. So they're pretty clear that the board and senior executives are responsible for providing an oversight over governance, risk, and internal controls, including any activities and roles that are delegated or outsourced. And Melanie fleshed it out quite nicely, but that's where I've seen people trip up a little bit, where they're moving 100 miles an hour and they have a great outsourcing policy and they're doing all the right things, but they're not documenting it. And then when their BMA are asking for the evidence, it's hard to backfill. So you've got to, you're moving quick as a startup, but you've got to go about it in a structured manner. They do champion, the 3 lines of defense model. The first line management, who are responsible for risk taking and also risk mitigation. The second line being the risk function and compliance. And then the third line, internal audit, who have a responsibility for providing that independent assurance over the control framework and the governance structure. They do provide some great guidance in their code of conduct on the expectations from those functions. And I think that's kind of a must read for anybody setting up and looking to get licensed.
Yeah, absolutely. And, let's have a sort of think about what it means to have that sort of head office in Bermuda and what you're really trying to establish from a regulatory perspective. They're looking at making sure that you've got, you can demonstrate, manage that the entity is managed and directed from Bermuda, and that's the entity's Bermuda Operations. And so, we are very aware of that and can help at Walkers in providing local directors that could help with that mind and management test, and with having board meetings in Bermuda to help demonstrate the direction and management. And Kevin, I know that you work very, very closely with startups and are often a resource for that kind of support. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you've been doing to help businesses scale up?
Sure. We've been trying to work with businesses as early as possible in the process, because just getting an understanding of how the businesses are functioning, what their scale strategy looks like in Bermuda and externally, and making sure that we can be a trusted advisor from as early as possible in the process, so that once we get to the regulatory stage, we have clear understanding of the business and can advise them in the right way. We're trying to position ourselves to become non-executive directors on the fintech boards, so that we can provide that fiduciary responsibility for them on the ground in Bermuda.
Yeah.
And then also, we're available as a senior rep and trusted advisor from start to finish to either connect them to whether it's compliance officers or money laundering officers or other stakeholders on the ground in Bermuda. But I think the key thing for us is the earlier that we can start working with them, whether it's on a board level or on an advisory capacity, then we can really help companies navigate whether it's the Bermuda regulatory ecosystem and requirements, or just doing business in a country they may not be familiar with. I think it's really important to have a local partner that can help you navigate the ins and outs of the jurisdiction.
Yeah, and even things like securing office space and, you know, and that sort of thing, you know, all of us can steer people in the right direction, and there's plenty of availability of office space of different sizes and shapes. And equally, I'll sort of plug the concierge service at government that can help with the work permits and making sure that you are aware as a digital assets business that if you have a need to sort of bring one of your skilled employees into Bermuda, then there are options to use fintech work permits, which means that you can get those in place pretty quickly. One of the other areas that we get asked to look at, which ties in a little bit with the head office, is Bermuda, as with all the other offshore jurisdictions, was required to implement economic substance laws. And again, they stipulate in certain circumstances that you have to have some sort of presence in a jurisdiction if you have income. So Mel, maybe if you could just give us a high-level overview of Bermuda's economic substance laws and which ones typically bite for a fintech startup.
Yeah, sure. So the economic substance laws in Bermuda apply to a relevant entity that's conducting a relevant activity in a relevant financial period. So by relevant entity, we mean pretty much any entity that's registered to do business in Bermuda with the Registrar of Companies. For the relevant activity, there is 9 relevant activities that are applicable, and I'll discuss that in a few minutes, which ones apply typically to fintech. And then the relevant financial period is the financial year of your entity when it's operating. So the relevant activities that we find are most applicable when we're advising digital asset business clients are sort of the financing and leasing. So if you're providing a credit facility, even if it's an intercompany loan and you're earning interest on that credit facility, then you'll be caught by the definition of financing and leasing. For service center, if your Bermuda entity is providing services to an affiliate overseas or to another entity, then you'll be caught in that aspect. A lot of time in the structuring, there might be a holding entity that's placed above the licensed entity, and that holding entity would be conducting the relevant activity of holding entity on the basis that it's not conducting any other commercial business. So we have to assess that. And then of course, IP. So if you are a Bermuda entity that's developing intellectual property and you're exploiting that IP asset, then you would be caught within the relevant activity definition of IP. So when you're establishing your sort of structure in Bermuda and you're establishing your business, it's really important to speak to your trusted advisors, whether that be Kevin and his team or Walker's, about what activities you're going to be doing within those entities to ensure that if you are caught, you have everything in place so that you don't fall foul of the economic substance requirements.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was just about to say, and I know Stafford, you often discuss ways for businesses to meet requirements stipulated by economic substance as well, right?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think everything that Melanie just said is really important for people to bear in mind. I think while there is a degree of flexibility in the BMA's approach to how and where executives are located, the economic substance requirements is a different kettle of fish, and the rules globally are still being vetted and ratified. And for high-tech, high-growth startups, you know, one of the key questions is, can I use Bermuda's tax neutrality as a way to optimize my commercial revenues? And the answer to that is maybe, but it goes beyond just having mind and management in the form of a local director if you actually want to go through the process of exploiting IP from a commercial standpoint. And this is one of the reasons why when we set ourselves up, we wanted to make sure that we had a critical mass of senior executives based in Bermuda. And, you know, we have experts across finance, technology, operations, marketing and enterprise sales. And these are the sorts of roles which, if you are going to look to exploit IP commercially, you need to have set up in Bermuda in order to do so. But what I would caveat is that for companies who are very, very early on, this is very complex, sophisticated territory. If you are a seed round or kind of Series A type player, then it may be too early for you to consider this. I think you need to get to be a little bit bigger and a little bit more evolved in your business before you go down this route, because it can become very complicated and very expensive very quickly. But that is not to say that there isn't a huge opportunity, and this is where the startups who are new can level the playing field with the traditional big tech companies. There is a much greater opportunity for a startup to be able to actually prove that they have developed IP in Bermuda than other bigger players who are just way more established and just can't make that argument. So yeah, it's an interesting one.
And another route. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Just to add to that, I think it was really important that the BMA added the T license, the test license, to the entire Digital Asset Business Act and regime, because it allows the earlier stage companies or even larger companies that want to test out Bermuda or test out a new product in Bermuda to get to speed, get to scale fast. For the BMA to take a look under the hood to see how it works. And then they can decide if they want to actually invest and build a proper operation in Bermuda. So I think the test license really changed the game for allowing people to come into Bermuda and test out a few different.
I absolutely agree, and again, it's a demonstration of the risk-based approach and the fact that it's not one size fits all for these companies. It very much depends on where they are, and the ability to scale as you grow the business, and the recognition that you won't have anything all in place day one is it's a game changer. One of the other areas that we get asked about is how the cybersecurity requirements are, what they are and what that means. And effectively, we have cybersecurity rules that require that any licensed DAB has a cybersecurity program in place. And even at the Class T level, they want to see how you're going to roll that out. So Brett, would you be able to explain what that looks like in practice, and how that could be, how you can assist with putting in place a cyber program that's suitable for a DAB?
Yeah, certainly, Natalie. So as you can imagine, given the activities that the Digital Assets Business Act covers, there is a heavy focus on cybersecurity. However, I would say that the BMA expectations requirements should be no different than management are already putting in place to address their risk. The BMA themselves have built their program on the NIST framework. There are other frameworks out there. If someone's selecting one, you could do worse than sticking with the regulator. It's the same language. And in line with that language, they require a program that covers the 5 core components of NIST: identifying your assets, protecting them, detecting threats, responding and recovering. I just wanted to touch on a few specific requirements. You do need an IT security policy in place. They do give the minimum areas that should be covered. They won't be a surprise to people: access controls, data governance, system and network security, incident response plans, etc. You need a CISO. As Mel mentioned previously, you can outsource that role. We do see that quite common depending on nature, scale, complexity of an organization. You might not need that full-time resource, and the BMA are fine with that. They also, there's a quarterly requirement for pen testing and vulnerability assessments. And your systems need to have audit trails in place, and so you can track back if there have been any threats that have actually crystallized. They do require an annual independent audit of your cyber program. That's kind of an evolving area. I think for some of the large exchanges, we're seeing SOC 2s, etc., and that's definitely going to be an answer, and it'll be acceptable. But that's not the right answer for everybody. They are quite big and expensive things. So that's something where it's going to pretty right-size itself as is what that independent review looks like. You also need to file some returns, along with your financial statements 4 months after the end of the year, which includes a report from your CISO and that independent report that we talked about. So, in summary, the requirements are fairly robust, but management should be putting those in place anyway. Just check the frequency and some of the filing requirements within the Act to make sure you're in compliance with those.
That's very helpful, thanks. And one other area of sort of regulatory compliance that's very important for digital assets businesses would be the area of anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing. Mel, a licensed digital assets business will be a regulated financial institution and must meet Bermuda's requirements. Can you let us know how you would approach that with a company looking to you to put in place policies that would meet those requirements?
Sure. So digital asset business will be defined as a regulated financial institution for the purposes of Bermuda's AML/ATF legislation. And what that means is that you must sort of build an entire compliance framework that includes international financial sanctions, screening to be compliant with the Bermuda law and the licensing requirements. So what we tend to see is we're assisting clients in two different ways. So where a digital asset business is sophisticated and has operations in different jurisdictions, they tend to have a global AML policy that sort of blanket covers all their operations around the various jurisdictions. And what we can do is review that global policy, conduct a sort of gap analysis, see if there's any gaps from a Bermuda law perspective, and where there is, create a Bermuda addendum or add in Bermuda language where applicable. What we often find we do need to help clients with, even in that instance, is preparing the sort of business risk assessment, client risk assessment, and AML/ATF risk assessment. Those are independent documents the BMA are going to expect to review, and they sit outside the policies and procedures and sort of dictate how those policies and procedures are going to be prepared. So even where there's a global framework in place, we often find we have to assist by preparing those individual documents and making sure they track through to the policies and procedures. And then the second sort of avenue that we find is building the compliance framework from scratch. So Walker's regulatory compliance team will review sort of your business plan or your investor deck or your white paper and start to build those risk assessment frameworks. It's a very interactive process with the client. We'll sit down with you, review those risk assessments, make sure they're in place correctly, and then build your policies and procedures from there. So it's just important from a BMA perspective that, you know, what your risks are being identified. There's then a control in place.
Yeah. And in talking about controls, Brett, can you briefly explain Bermuda options with respect to the requirements for external and internal audits? I note that you don't need to have an audit in place for Class T, but certainly for Class M and F, they're looking for you to have those in place. And how difficult is that in Bermuda right now?
So they are a little different. So I'll start with internal audit. I mentioned before the 3 lines of defense. So internal audit's at the 3rd line. Their job is to give an independent assessment around the governance and control framework. So to give that independent assessment, they need to be independent. So there's no opportunity to dual hat between the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd lines. They need to be independent. For that reason, we do see that function outsourced a lot, and not just in the digital asset sector, insurance startups, etc. It's a pretty common model the BMA are comfortable with. They'll do some risk-based reviews every year and then report to the board or the audit committee. It's a function I'd encourage you to create early. I think there's some real value. I'm a little biased. I do a lot of this, but I think there's some real value in having internal audit at the start of the journey. Measure twice, cut once, etc. So they can help you design those controls. When they're coming down the path and identify gaps, etc. It's harder to close them then. They also get to work much more closely with your risk function, truly understand the business, and then focus their time so they're more efficient and effective. External audit, that comes under the digital account business rules that were that were published earlier this year. So you need to have an external auditor on board who will audit your statutory balance sheet and the accompanying notes. They don't have to be local. I think that reflects the fact that it's a new sector where onboarding a clients is difficult for some of the external audit firms. Expect them to start those conversations early. Expect those auditors to have questions around your control environment. You only require the audit after your 1st year of operation, but it's going to take a lot longer than you think to onboard. So again, start that process early would be my tip.
Thank you, Brett. And, you know, we've talked a lot about how you can sort of help set up a business from an operational perspective, but that isn't everything. Kevin, can you talk about other things that we're doing in Bermuda to try and ensure that we build up an environment in which digital assets businesses will succeed and, like, you know, really enjoy being in Bermuda?
It's hard not to, Natalie, with the pink sand beaches, but you know, I think we're trying to be as conscious of where we are in the journey as possible, and we're getting into year 3, 4 of our digital asset Odyssey, and I think we're just very fortunate that we had support from the government at the outset to lead us and really attract world-class companies. We have this international regulator who's respected around the world and is leading in the Global Financial Innovation Network to bring innovative solutions to the market. And now we're really looking to launch the Bermuda Innovation and Technology Association, that we can galvanize the private sector, start to convene industry that's set up in Bermuda, and make sure that we can drive things forward into the future. We're looking at you know, facilitating meetups so that when folks are on the ground in Bermuda, there's a community of like-minded innovators that they can connect into. And through the pandemic, we've seen a really big increase in digital nomads choosing Bermuda as a jurisdiction to live from, operate from. As the Premier said, come to Bermuda and code on the beach. And so, you know, we're really excited about what's happened, you know, and the growth that we've seen despite this global pandemic that we're all facing. So we're really excited to make the announcement about the new association that we're launching, because we think it's going to really build that bridge from Bermuda into big associations around the world, so that our companies can onboard into those jurisdictions as well.
Yeah, and we've seen that sort of in the insurance sector, you know, having those sort of associations helps bring everybody together and support in terms of legislative changes, in terms of just social interaction and important things and solving problems for the industry. So I think that's awesome. You know, unfortunately, I could talk forever to you guys and really enjoy doing so. I know you're passionate about your business and about helping digital assets business thrive in Bermuda. But unfortunately, I have to wrap up. To the extent that anybody has questions for any of our panelists, please visit the Walker's booths. We'll be happy to make introductions as we do every day. I love working with these guys. They're great, and they will be an excellent resource for you. So thank you very much for listening. Do let us know if there's any questions, and I hope you've enjoyed this session. Thank you.